Hi, it's Lynn again, and in this stop on our whirlwind tour through secondary sources, we're going to talk about some sort of basic reference materials and some topical annotations. So just a quick slide on abbreviations. I'm sure, are starting to get used to case abbreviations and statutory abbreviations. However, throughout your whole legal career, you're going to find even more just random abbreviations that you don't recognize. So you are, I'm sure, already, or at least probably already familiar with the Blue Book, which for all of its flaws, does at least give you a lot of translation tables for legal abbreviations. Another really good source for legal abbreviations is a print-only source that's Prince's Dictionary of Legal Abbreviations. This used to be called Beaver's. Some people will still call it this, so if you hear it referred to either way, it's the same source. And then there are some other sources for legal abbreviations that are discussed at this LibGuide. So let's move on. Let's take a little break from our defamation hypothetical, and let's just say you're in the elevator one morning and a senior attorney has a pretty random seeming question for you before they leave the elevator. So they want to know, could you argue that a sweater is a dangerous weapon for the purposes of an assault case? And they want to know this by the afternoon. So you need to get a quick answer for this person. So one place you might start is a dictionary, or at least you might think it's a good place to start. I think all secondary sources have their place. However, dictionaries are usually not my favorite source, and we'll look at why. I just don't find them super helpful most of the time. For scholarly purposes, you might want to use Black's sometimes. That's available on Westlaw. If you go into either this main secondary sources page or any of the individual secondary sources, we'll usually have this tools and resources sidebar here on the right. And Black's is linked in that tools and resources column. So the search in Black's is a little fussy. If you are searching this dictionary term line, then you're only going to be searching these definition words that are in all caps here. So if you need to do a broader search, if you're not sure where the word is going to occur, you want to actually probably do most of your searching in this definition text box. And I'll show you why I don't love Black's for practice purposes, which is like, it's citing to a textbook of criminal law from the 70s. The one thing that is really nice in Black's for scholarly purposes, not going to be super useful probably a lot of the time in practice, although it could be, is when a term was first used. So if you're familiar with the Oxford English Dictionary, where it tries to establish like when a word was first used in English, this does that, but for legal terminology. So that can actually be really helpful. That's probably, to me at least, I think that's probably the most useful thing in Black's, right? Like this law of defamation is at least a treatise rather than a textbook, but it's also the 1970s version. So, for scholarly purposes, you might want Black sometimes. I don't think you're going to want it a lot as an actual practicing attorney. Lexis does have some dictionaries in it as well, and these specialized dictionaries are actually quite helpful, can actually be quite helpful. So for example, this Attorney's Dictionary of Patent Claims will not just give you a definition, it gives you a sample patent number that you could go look at and see how that word is used in the context of a patent. But the sort of broader dictionaries on Lexis, they're quicker than Black's, which as you can see really goes on. But I don't think they're hugely more helpful. As you can see, this broad, right? Like it's almost like the circular definition. What could be really nice is that it does give you cross references to parts of Amjur that could get into more depth. Unfortunately, every single one of these, I tried searching several terms in the Lexis dictionaries, and every single one of these in Ballantyne's where there was this cross reference, I tried plugging in to get it to show to you guys as an example, and every single one of them was wrong. So I wouldn't get too excited when you see this in Ballantyne's if you ever use this source. So far, you haven't really gotten very far and you've spent some time. If you did want to use dictionaries, there's this list from the University of Washington that's a list of a whole bunch of legal dictionaries. What might be sometimes helpful is these plain language dictionaries that are just free online. So if you know someone that's, hasn't gone to law school, that's not an attorney, that's a layperson, that just wants like a real simple plain language explanation of something, these are free. You can just send people links to these. What can be a little more useful is words and phrases on West. And the reason why this is more useful is that it's not just a definition, it's a definition by a judge in a case. And you can limit it to just your jurisdiction. You could limit it to civil or criminal cases as well. So not only are you getting a definition, you're getting a definition in California case law, and you're seeing references to the California Penal Code as well, which is where the judges are deriving their definitions from. Still also a really simple definition, and it is kind of circular because this happens to be something with a little bit of a circular definition, but it tells you where in the penal code you would go to look for how it's defined. And as you guys, I'm sure we'll talk about later, you can shepherdize statutes just like you shepherdize case law and find more cases on point. A definition from a case, which is way more citable than a definition from a dictionary. A source that I think maybe got beat up on a little unfairly in the UVA video that you guys watched is legal encyclopedias. They can be federal, they can be national, they can be cross-jurisdictional. There are also state-level encyclopedias, and I think even the folks from UVA were saying that state-level ones are a little bit more useful, and that I would actually agree with hugely. But we'll take a look. These really are not terrible sources. They're not something that you would cite to, but a lot of secondary sources are not things you would cite to, right? A lot of these are published by West at this point, so a lot of these are just going to be on Westlaw. Amjur and Caljur are on both Lexis and West. However, West has an entire Amjur series that is sort of more like the practice guides that we looked at in the last video. And if you use Amjur on West, you'll be able to cross-reference between Amjur and those more practice guide-like other sources that West publishes as part of the Amjur series. And I'll show you one of those in a minute. So again, because a lot of these are on West, I'm using West and filtering in their secondary sources. You can, once you're in secondary sources, just look for encyclopedias, which they're calling jurisprudence and encyclopedias. CJS, Corpus Juris Secundum, is another one of the big cross-jurisdictional national encyclopedias. As is causes of action is also can be really useful as well. So I see a couple of things that look pretty useful as a starting place. So CJS, like I mentioned, whole country. Caljur, just California. If I start with CJS, actually, a shoe in Massachusetts was a deadly weapon for purposes of one case. So this question might not be as completely off the wall as it might have seemed at first. However, when we look in California, as a reminder, the table of contents in West shows up on the side. Usually highly recommend looking and seeing if there are other things that are useful. So in this case, this next thing that the entry on the next slide is this particular objects or instruments. So it will tell you, this gives you, as you'll see, a list of specific things that have shown up in California case law as deadly weapons. These are a lot more serious and a lot more weapon-like than a shoe or a sweater. Again, nice cross-references to the forms, the Amjur forms, ALR entries, which we'll talk about in a second. So, but quickly you have established that in California, there's probably not going to do it, but you could at least try to use some persuasive authority from another jurisdiction if you really, really wanted to try to make this argument. And for doing a quick search that by the time you look through all this stuff and read it, probably, is not going to take you hours and hours and hours and hours, and you don't have more than that. I mean, you don't have more than a couple of hours probably anyway. This is probably as much as you're going to be able to establish quickly in a couple of hours. So you're probably as good as you're going to get for your afternoon phone call. One more thing to note, in CalJur, any of these, in AmJur as well, for a lot of articles, as you scroll down at the very end of the entry, you're going to see if there is recent case law, they do these sort of cumulative supplements. Here's the Raimundo case that we found through words and phrases earlier. So there's a lot of different entry points that you might use to get at the same place. And just as a reminder, CalJur is also in Lexis, and if you wanted to get around that table of contents, it's at the top. So let's take a quick look at American jurisprudence trials, going back to our defamation hypothetical, because we've probably gone about as far as we can go quickly anyway on our assault hypothetical. Let's say we've gotten to the point where we are thinking about trial prep. And I want to show you AmJur trials because you'll see it is an awful lot like the practice guides we looked at in the last video. There's this thorough, detailed index that, much like some of the other practice guides, just laid out like what are the elements of the case. You could see, it does the same thing. There are research references that we'll look at that are pretty thorough. So if we look down through our index at the top, right? So procedural issues. So again, this is really practice guide-like. There are some sections that you would want to read just specifically on public officials. There's state law variations included in here. So even though this is a national cross-jurisdictional source, you could look for some information on California. Another nice thing that's in here, in some of these entries, are sample documents based on a hypothetical. So this gives you like a little background and then how you might think about drafting things based on that. So that might help you when you're writing your own documents. Those research references, both secondary, right? Some of these treatises and practice guides specifically on defamation and First Amendment law, which could also be really useful, are linked to right here. And then primary authority. So if you were looking for, in this case, the statutes across the states, also right here. All kinds of other secondary sources too. And let's take a look at ALR, since it turns out that there is an entry on who are public figures, who are public officials for the purposes of defamation actions. So those look really useful in ALR, and this will give us a good segue to look at ALR. So what is ALR? These are annotations that are usually based on things that are unsettled, where there are jurisdictional differences. They're usually really, really specific. Where there is an ALR entry on your topic, they are incredibly helpful because they are incredibly thorough, but there may not be one on your topic. There is ALR, which is cross-jurisdictional, and then ALR federal, which is going to deal with federal issues. And ALR is in both Lexis and West. And in both Lexis and West, if you search across, you're going to search both ALR and ALR federal. West has these links to narrower topics. I really don't recommend using these. This is just one source where these just happen to not be useful. It's kind of arranged strangely, and you will often miss stuff if you try to narrow it this way. It's really better to just keyword search across the whole thing or use the index. Whenever you're in an ALR entry, so we can see this is our public figure entry, it's always good to look at the scope of the entry because these are really specific. So for example, you can see this entry is just for purposes of application of the New York Times rule. It's also time limited, although the cases are cases that happen after a case in 1974. So time is probably but we spend a lot of time reading the entry because these are long and detailed. you would want to figure out what the New York Times rule is to see whether or not it applies in your case. Another thing that is nice, that is unfortunately West only, you can't do this in Lexis, these ALR entries are enormous. And so it's nice to be able to filter to just your jurisdictions of interest. So, we're in California, we're in the Ninth Circuit, and then it will just highlight those parts of the entry that cite to authority in your jurisdictions of interest. The other thing that is going to be in both that's also super useful is there are tables of cases, laws, rules that are organized by jurisdiction. Even though you're missing this filter in Lexis, you can still look for just things in a particular jurisdiction in this table. There's also that thorough list of research references. So just like the Andrew Trials entry we looked at, right? There's both links to primary authority and a whole lot more secondary sources as well, not just ALR. There are West's key numbers. Both this and Amjur had West's key numbers, 3 points to find more sources. ALR does have a good index. 2 ways you can search it. You can go through it alphabetically. I often find that a frustrating way to search. You could click into the index, open up this index contents links, and it will give you an alphabetical list. I tried D first for defamation, which then led me to L for libel and slander. When I look in libel and slander, there's not one consolidated entry for public officers. It just tells you, oh, look other places in this entry. I don't know whether public officer also includes public figure. The way I usually search ALR's index is keyword searching, because it will also pull up useful things around just that one, not just that one entry where you're trying to kind of guess at how things are alphabetically. You're still just searching the index, so you're getting really focused results, but you're seeing things that are maybe not just what you would think of by doing that kind of alphabetical search. That kind of flipping around in the index is great in paper alphabetically, but since you're using something electronically, why not take advantage of it and do this kind of keyword searching is the way I usually do it. And in fact, you can see there's an entry just on the New York Times rule. You'd want to look at that. And there's a public figures entry that's separate from this libel and slander entry. So to me, I think probably an easier way to get at your defamation issues for your public figure. And that's the end of our whirlwind tour of this part of secondary sources. In the last video, we're going to look at legal periodicals, uniform laws, and restatements. So thanks, and I will see you soon.